Hi and welcome. In this chapter, we will discuss about AWS Identity and Access Management. So, AWS Identity and Access Management, you can specify who or what can access services and resources in AWS, centrally manage fine-grained permissions, and analyze access to refined permissions across AWS. So, IAM is nothing but you are going to define who are the users and what permission they need and on what resource they need that permissions. So if you look into this particular diagram over here, so here who represents the user. So you can create users in IAM. So those users we are referring it as who, and then comes can access. So this represents the permissions. So in AWS there are n number of permissions. For example, let's say read only, full administrator, or only they have the access to create the virtual machines, etc., etc. So there are n number of permissions are available in AWS. So this particular thing is represents the permissions. And the last one is on what. So on what resource they need the permissions. For example, let's say I have the user and I got a read only permission, but on what resource they need the read only. For example, only on the EC2 instance, which is VMs, or only on the storage, or only on the VPC or network. So these are the three things comes under IAM in a nutshell. So in order to brief IAM once again, so you need to define the users first, and then you're going to define the permissions, and then you're going to define the resource on which you need the permissions. So using this we can secure our AWS infrastructure so that only the required user will have access on the particular resources, and that also they have the required permissions. So it is always advised not to provide any any extra permissions. So you need to carefully assess your users and you need to define the permissions accordingly. So in IAM, we need to consider few things. First one is users, which I already covered, the users which you are going to create, and they can have access to multiple applications or multiple resources in the AWS. Second thing is groups. So in AWS IAM, you can create groups. Group will help you to add multiple users to single group so that you no need to assign permissions on multiple users. Instead of you create one single group and assign the permission to that group. So within that group, you can add multiple users so that you can manage your user and save the time. So third one, we have roles. So roles are nothing but set of permissions. So each role may have multiple permissions. So it is combined together and we are considering that as roles. Fourth one, we have policies. Policies are nothing but individual permissions. For example, let's say if you consider about virtual machines. So in this virtual machine, we have multiple permissions. For example, permission to create virtual machines, permission to read the virtual machine properties, permission to delete the virtual machine, or permission to do only read only to the virtual machine. So individual things are considered as policies. However, in roles, it is a combined. For example, let's say EC2 administrator. So if you look into this particular role, EC2 administrator, then it comes multiple permissions within it. For example, let's say create, delete, read only, etc., etc. So everything will combined, everything will comes under this particular role. So this is the main difference between groups and roles. So when you assign the role to any, so when you talk about the roles, for example, you have a roles. So you can assign this role to either to a user, or you can also assign to user group, or you can also assign it to the services, Amazon service. For example, let's say EC2 instance. So you can assign the IAM role to your EC2 instance as well as user group, or also to the users. And also you can apply to some Amazon resources as well. So it is not only necessary you can only assign it to users or user group. It can also assign it to EC2 or any other AWS services which supports the role.